Hello, I'm Jennifer Keller, Programming Coordinator at the Westport Library. Thank you so much for joining me today for another Westport Reads 2021 program, a conversation with Nesrine Malik on her book, We Need New Stories. This year's Westport Reads focused on confronting racism and finding ways to construct a more equitable future for everyone. We Need New Stories examines 6 political myths used to deflect and discredit demands for social justice. And hopefully, by understanding and debunking these myths, we can learn to reframe the future. Nesrine Malik is an award-winning Sudanese columnist and features writer for The Guardian, and this is her first book. Catherine Lewis is a member of the teaching faculty at Ackerman Institute for the Family and specializes in working with individuals and families impacted by interpersonal and systemic trauma. She is also a member of Team Westport. Please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we'll ask as many as we have time for after the conversation. The webpage for purchasing your copy of We Need New Stories will stay live through 10 p.m. tonight in case you'd like to buy a copy after this conversation. So thank you so much for coming, and take it away.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer and Nesrine. I'm so happy to have this time with you, and thank you so much for agreeing to come and share your work and your wisdom with the community of Westport, Connecticut. And for those of you who have not, I know you have it in 2 different, I think it's a different cover, but I would recommend, if you have not read the book, to please get it. It really is powerful, and I think is very necessary for this time. So can we just get started by, Nesrine, can you summarize the 6 myths? I mean, name the 6 myths and just tell us a little bit about each one, and then that can be our jump off for the conversation.
Great, will do. Before I start, I am so excited to be here. I'm just very grateful to have the space and the time to talk about the book, and also grateful for your close reading of it as well. So big heartfelt thanks from me. So the book is about generally 6 myths. We're going to detail about 6 specific myths that get in the way of equality, or as is in the sort of US version, it's the myths that subvert freedom. And that's how I think about them, is that there are ways in which people's moves or desires to create equality or freedom or just a more equitable society are resisted. And this resistance is not irrational, it's not obvious, it's kind of subtle and insidious, and actually incredibly powerful because it's subtle and insidious. And so the 6 myths that I focus on are broadly about how, the way I think about it is that the world is made up not of people on the right and the left, but it's made up of people at the center and the periphery. And what the myths do is they stop people on the margins making any inroads to getting closer to the center. And so on that note, the myths are the myth of gender equality, which is that we have made these huge strides in gender equality, and therefore there are very few problems really that we need to worry about when it comes to gender. The second myth is the myth of political correctness, which is that we live in this society, or the myth of wokeness. You could update it now for like the current moral hysteria. The myth of wokeness / political correctness, which is that we live in a world that is beholden to these sort of censorious, thin-skinned impulses to police how we talk and how we refer to other people. The third myth is the myth of the free speech crisis, which is that we live in a time where free speech is being threatened by the woke, by the previous myth. The fourth myth is the myth of damaging identity politics, which is a myth really that really gained traction after the Trump victory in 2016, which was this idea that behavior by people of color along political lines was damaging solidarity, damaging universal goals. The fifth myth is the myth of historical exceptionalism, or as I call it, virtuous origin, which is that the United States is based on, like Joe Biden said a couple of days ago, an idea, not geographical. It's so great to write a book like this, because every time someone says something, I'm like, chapter 4. Yeah, the myth of virtuous origin, which is that, you know, America is based on this sort of virtuous idea, virtuous principle.
That we need to get back to very quick, that we,
yeah,
yes.
Exactly. The sort of the DNA of America is sound, and how damaging that is, because it basically prevents self-reflection. And the last myth, which is my favorite myth, is the myth of the reliable narrator, which kind of underpins the rest of the myths, in the sense that there is no way we can come to grips with them, because there is an entire narrator class, from the media to publishing to academia, that propagates these myths or sort of regurgitates them, or just sort of projects them on behalf of the powerful without really questioning them. So those are the 6 myths in general.
And so can you go into, and maybe you can use some examples, how the myths get propagated? Because it's through these, and right, by the narrators, I think both intentionally and unintentionally playing into the myths. But they're specific tools that you know, I was underlying everything in the book, but in terms of the tools that are used, and that you actually hear them in conversation, and it's like a little alert to you, oh, they're using that tool right now. Because I think it would be helpful for the audience too, as we're engaged in conversations, and there are times where I notice, like, I will be trying to make a point, and then I get stuck, and I don't, you know, I want to stay engaged in conversation, but I see the tools operating all the time, and some of the ways in which I've used the tools too.
So I'm very grateful for this question, because what underpins myths is tools. And the way myths survive and gain traction is via a set of argumentative tools that are incredibly powerful, because they sound extremely logical. I like to think of the tools guy or gal, I'm not being biased, not playing any word games with the word tool. But you know, the guy who's like, I'm just playing devil's advocate. That's the guy who will say, who will kind of throw out a tool at you. And the tools are kind of tailored to every myth, but they have some broad principles. So when you make an argument for gender equality, for political correctness, for identity politics, for revisiting our history, you get a response that is a tool response. And like I said, they're tailored to the myth, but there's some broad principles. One of the biggest tools, most effective tools, is the tool of progress. So people will say, but look how far we've come. You know, look how far we've come. Why are you creating an unnecessary sense of crisis when actually gender equality metrics are fantastic? You know, when actually African Americans have, in a very short space of time, secured all their civil rights. Or say, for example, you know, why are you going on about American history when there's so many, you know, we've made so many strides in terms of confronting our history. Have you not seen all the kind of movies that we've made about slavery, how we talk about slavery all the time? So this tool of progress, it chills conversation immediately, because you look like you're being greedy, or you look like you're being irrational. So what I do in the book is try and explain that, like, that is a valid point, but its purpose is to actually stop you from asking for more equality. And the response to that tool is, progress isn't absolute, right? Progress doesn't mean, because some progress has happened, doesn't mean all progress has happened, which is a very simple but very powerful way to responding to that tool. A second tool that's used quite frequently, specifically around sort of race and immigration and kind of integration of marginalized ethnicity and identities in general, is the tool of universalism, which is why don't we all just kind of stick together and focus on like one thing, you know, focus on class or focus on economics or focus on something that we all have some sort of purchase on. You know, if you focus on your own identity or your own needs as a woman, as a person of color, as a person of LGBT orientation, what that does is it turns other people off because they have no common cause with you. And the tool of universalism is most often invoked when it comes to Black Lives Matter. When people say all lives matter, that's a tool of universalism. Because what they're trying to do is stop you asking for your rights by saying, well, everyone has rights. Why should we care about your rights in particular? And the response to that tool is to say, well, people are discriminated against or their rights are denied based on their identity. So you have to start there. The goal is to be universal. The goal is to get to a point where we all have universal needs because we are all treated in the same universal way. So it's just about kind of thinking about how to respond to these tools, number one, and number two, also knowing when not to respond, because you just know that this is somebody who's just using this argument but hasn't really thought about the end product of it, isn't really interested in a conversation. So tools do two things. They stop the conversation, but they also sometimes signify to you that the other party is not really interested in good faith discourse once you've given them that response. And as an opinion writer or op-ed writer, what my training is in kind of logic and sort of philosophically tying logic together. And once you think about these arguments almost as sort of mathematical, it becomes easy to respond to them because they don't become about like emotion or provocation or whatever. It's just kind of an exercise in logic, really.
So can you maybe give an example of I mean, there's from each of the chapters, but you told a story about a student who, you know, asked, just like a group of students, I think students of color, asking for if there would be possibility to include some additional writers in the syllabus, and the impact of the response back was it met with almost as if the request was violent, how they were treated. And maybe if you could give that as an example and then highlight the tools, because I think, you know, again, this sort of came back with such the faculty felt so almost attacked by a simple request.
Yes, and this happens across the board. So this is, it's an incident that happened in the UK. There are very similar incidents in the US as well, where someone amongst the student body started a conversation about adding new writers to a literature syllabus. It wasn't even a political syllabus, which is a perfectly valid request. Faculties do that all the time, you know, syllabuses change. And what happened was that story then became about a sort of woke mob trying to decolonize the syllabus or the curriculum at Oxford University. And then it was such an alarming episode. It was one of the episodes that really made me start thinking about this book, because what was an incredibly banal, prosaic, everyday event that happens all the time across universities across the world became something about people on the margins encroaching on the center, right? So this student who literally just was like, should we have a conversation about this? Right. Because she was Black, because she had a funny name, you know, because she wasn't sort of Jane Thompson, because she was, you know, Lola Olufemi, became this target for the right-wing media. Her picture was plastered all over the newspapers. She was portrayed as this kind of militant person who was trampling on the sanctity of Oxford University. Oxford then became this kind of symbol of what is right and holy in the British academic space. And before anyone had verified any of the details of the story, she had become a hate figure. She was getting hate mail, death threats. It's still the first thing that comes up when you Google her name, even though she's since published a fantastic book. When I spoke to her, she said that it wasn't her that she was worried about, but her colleagues that come from quite poor families, you know, her peer group, other Black students who were afraid that they would get blacklisted, wouldn't get jobs afterwards. So what was really interesting about that incident, and a sort of, there's a US corollary to that, an incident in the Myths That Subvert Freedom, where a student, a transgender student, was reported in the media as attacking female students in the sort of public facilities in the school. And it turned out that none of it had happened, as none of it had happened at Oxford University. So one of the way the tools kind of give these myths velocity is that they imbue them with this like patina of legitimacy, right?
Right.
So they're presented in ways that are extremely non-hysterical, right? Extremely sort of fact-based, logical. This is where the narrators come in. Right. And so you just think, well, it was in the New York Times, you know, or it was on the BBC. Surely it can't be a made-up story. But it's terrifying how many made-up stories of that variety are in the press, not because people go out of their way to make up these stories, but because the narrative is so powerful and it's so compelling that there are these groups that are vandalizing, you know, they're vandalizing our curriculums, they are attacking our spaces, they are empowered by liberal left-wing institutions. The narrative is so fertile and so compelling to the audience that people really fall all over themselves to kind of put things in that frame. So in the Reliable Narrators chapter, I talk about how the sort of mindset of established people in the media and academia in general is so pro-establishment and pro-status quo that when they see something like this, their instinct is to be like, well, they're coming for me. They're coming for us. You know, these hordes at the gate are coming for us. And so they don't question the way the story has become reported to them in the first place. Does that make sense?
No, it makes tremendous sense. And it is so, even in just one-on-one conversations, like the experience of, you know, asking for something or proposing something, and the almost like the, you know, I'm a therapist, the fear response that gets evoked, whether you call that white fragility or whatever, or just like literally there is this idea that somebody is coming to take what is yours, which is frightening how strong that narrative is, and that the physical and visceral impulse.
And so this is basically what the myths are all about, right? The myths are about convincing people who think that they're winning, they're not always winning, that somebody's coming to take something from them. And the US is very evolved in its myth making in that sense, because it's a very individualistic society. We have glorified kind of neoliberal meritocracy, this idea that like anyone can become president of the United States, you know, this idea that if you are, you know, it's a level playing field, everyone can do well. And so in a culture that so fetishizes individual achievement and completely discounts systemic limitations on people, you need these myths to convince people that their achievements are hard won and that they are theirs, as opposed to because they were born, you know, in certain circumstances and certain privilege. So why talk about in the book this idea of myths as status quo stabilizers, right? Yes. What the myths do is that they convince people that this is the best way to be. The world is not unequal. There are no systemic challenges to anyone. And once you convince people that the default is benign, then you make them very suspicious of change, right?
Yes. So even, and I would say, I mean, we were talking a little bit before, what happened in January 6th in this country, sort of the complete sort of result of these myths working in a fierce way, right? I mean, do you want to speak a little bit to that?
Yes, I would. So when I just missed the Capitol event when the US draft was finished, but it could have been, I mean, if I could draw a straight line between the myth of identity politics and what happened at the Capitol, there would not be a kink in that line. Like the idea, what I focus on in the identity politics chapter is that we focus so much and we pathologize identity politics by non-white people, and we completely excuse, I don't even see identity politics by white people. We don't even see it because it's just like, it has been so defaulted, right? It's been so programmed in us that white people behave for sophisticated reasons, right? They behave because they are either oppressed economically or socially, or they behave in certain ways because they're very smart and educated and know what they're doing. So we put this like humongous trust in white leaders and politicians when they can be completely intellectually bankrupt and in fact intellectually challenged. And we excuse and feel sorry for white people on the lower end of the spectrum because we can only think of them as victims, because race has no part of this at all, because we think of race as something that is enacted by people on the margins. Identity politics is practiced by everyone. It's practiced most successfully by white people. It's practiced preemptively and aggressively by white people. Like,
can I just pause? I'm going to feel like, I don't know, Oprah in this or Brene Brown's pause, but like that is, it's practiced by white people the most. Yeah. But that is, can you just say that again?
Yeah, identity politics is practiced most often by white people and most successfully by white people. If you look at the history of disenfranchisement of people of color from the political system in the US, that is why identity politics at play, right? Because what it's trying to do is stop people voting for their own rights and therefore taking a bit away from them. So there's a kind of, I guess, benign practice of identity politics by white people, which is to kind of make, hoard their race capital. There's a quote I have in the book, which has really stayed with me, where someone says that whiteness is basically like a trust fund, and you have, it's a currency and you hoard it by trying to maintain your kind of white associated privileges. And then on the extreme end, it is violent and it is murderous. And if you look at the figures, it is shocking. If you look at the figures, something like over the past 10 years, the overwhelming majority, more than 90% of terror-related incidents in the US were white supremacists or far right. And in terms of the money or the funds dedicated to fighting extremism, a fraction was dedicated to far right or white supremacist terror, and a whole bunch was dedicated towards Islamic terror. And so the problem with, and this is, we'll come to this, like the problem with myths is that they actually stop us from seeing what the fundamental issue is. And so the situation we have in the US is that there is a extremely potent, violent, sort of very high casualty identity politics movement, but no one's talking about it. We're talking about Black Lives Matter, we're talking about South American gangs, we're talking about Muslim extremism. And there was a report in the New York Times, which I kind of respect them for, even though it was late, a couple of years into the Trump administration, where they were like, we missed it. Like, we totally missed this whole white terror. angle because they were so fixated on finding all these sort of redeeming narratives for people who voted for Donald Trump. There was this whole, I don't know if you remember, there was this whole kind of sympathetic figure that everyone fixated on, this coal miner with like
the hillbilly elegy, right? What that book? Yeah.
Exactly. And the New York Times really jumped on that, like the idea of this like coal miner, his face streaked with dust, his kind of community falling apart, doesn't know a single Black person, but kind of doesn't mind them, right? And so that sort of, no one really talked about the sort of racial animus behind that and made it all economic. And so once you, like people think when I say I'm talking about identity politics myth, they think that what I'm trying to do is justify behavior by people of color. There's a little bit of that, but what I'm trying to do really is say like, look over there, you know, that's where we should be looking. Identity politics is indeed damaging, but it's not coming from where you think it's coming from. And just I'll get to your question. The Capitol insurrection was, you know, this massive sort of chickens coming home to roost episode where people were like, oh, you know, it's just the, you know, it's the left behind, it's the conspiracy theorists, it's the sort of people who got depressed in lockdown. There was all these discounts and minimizations of what was rumbling before the Capitol attack. And then when it happened, no one knew it, could see it coming. And since the denial runs so deep that even since it's happened, there is a real reluctance to try and come to terms and figure out this like hugely significant traumatic event in American history, right?
Right. And the tools being used in force, right? The minimization, denial, the finding empathy, right? It's just interesting who we find empathy for and who we don't.
Yeah. So one of the tools, sorry, just this is an important point. When it comes to identity politics, one of the really important tools is something I call the accepting of whiteness. And so once you see people applying different standards, you know, once you see people, you can see it with kind of terror attacks. White people are lone wolves, right? They are abused children, which might be true. I'm not saying that everyone needs to be pathologized, but we have a real eagerness to understand and contextualize and minimize, you know, a lone wolf, there is no one else. But when it's Muslims, people of color, Black people, they are just the avant-garde in this massive movement that's coming for you because that's what those people do, right? So the accepting of whiteness is a really important theme in how that myth functions.
And so to connect this with the myth of the sort of narrator is that, you know, so the New York Times did say we miss this, but the who's telling the stories and who is a constant challenge. And if the people who are reporting the stories and the people who are listening to are buying into the myths, whether intentionally or unintentionally, it feels very scary to know. So if you can speak a little bit to that and maybe some anecdotes to that.
Yeah, I mean, the reliable narrator or unreliable narrator myth is a really tricky one because it verges, if you're not careful, on just dismissing everything as fake news.
Yes.
I'm not talking about that. I'm not saying that the narrator class is a fabulous class. It's not sitting there making stuff up. But it's more about the worldview and the incredibly tiny pool the narrator class comes from. This is something that I find constantly shocking. It's an evergreen shock in my life as someone in the media who is not from that demographic, but who is kind of tangentially from it, how exclusive the media world is in the US and the UK. We are talking more exclusive than the elite. We are talking more exclusive than finance, than law. There is something about, and also the problem with the media as well these days is that there's been a flight to the top because it's become difficult to maintain a financially viable media organization. And so it's now really concentrated at the top with, you know, CNN, Washington Post, New York Times, MSNBC, kind of elite East Coast organizations. And in the UK, very much so, like The Guardian, the BBC. I can speak about The Guardian, which has a very big and successful US operation, is that I was shocked how many people went to just Oxford and Cambridge. Like, imagine working anywhere where your colleagues not only went to the same universities, but they knew each other from university and had the same experiences. Sometimes I talk about a limited gene pool, and it is sometimes literally a gene pool in that you have people's siblings and kids and wives and partners. And what that does is it creates, whatever your background is, if there is too much of a concentration of people from the same class and the same ethnic background, it creates a uniformity of worldview. If they were all Black, public school educated people, you would have the same issue, right? So it's not me going after sort of exclusivity in the sense that I think that you are more likely to be, to have a blind spot if you're white or if you're affluent. But I just think it's not healthy to have a concentration of people from the same background all the time. So the way that works is that when, for example, in the UK, Brexit was rumbling, there are so few immigrants in UK newsrooms that no one felt that there was this really big anger about immigration in the UK, because no one really knew any immigrants or hung out with them or had any experience with them. And so they were like, I mean, surely people aren't going to vote for Brexit. If you spoke to immigrants, they were like, it's definitely happening because this country has become so anti-immigration over the past few years. These are my experiences. An analog to that happened in the US with the Trump election.
Totally.
Right? Where people were like, I mean, it's not going to happen. I actually have an anecdote in the book about an East Coast journalist who, I was on the phone to him the night of the election, and he said, I'm going to go to Times Square and just soak it up because Trump is going to get his ass kicked. They were so certain it was going to happen because when they did go to the hillbilly elegy communities, they just saw people who looked like them, but who didn't have money, right? They just didn't understand that you can have attitudes towards racism that are problematic without being an actively racist person. There were very few Black people in newsrooms that had enough empowerment and confidence to be like, are you picking anything up? Do you think maybe there's going to be some like white lash against Obama? It all came afterwards. There was this like massive reckoning afterwards where like they scrambled to get Black people into the op-ed pages. There was this idea that there was like a calamity that happened to white people. Maybe that's why they voted for Trump. And it took a good couple of years for that myth to be unwound. People were like, oh yeah, no, actually it was just about race most of the time. You know, that's what it was about. And we would have saved ourselves a lot of time, a lot of angst, and actually given our politicians a better chance to get ahead of what happened in 2016 if there was a more equitable reflection of what the world really looks like. So that's why I think the media is one of the biggest problems when it comes to kind of questioning these myths, is because they fall back into their comfort zone, into their exceptionalism. I mean, we saw it even when Biden won. I was braced for this. I was like, there's going to be a huge sigh of relief on the part of East Coast elites. They're going to be like, it's done, it's finished. It was all the bad dream. It's okay. You know,
have my latte.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to go back to brunch, as AOC said. And all that language came back. You know, America is back. That was a big one. You know, we're just going to, and one of the reasons the Capitol insurrection is being minimized is not just because the right doesn't want to talk about it. It's also because the left isn't interested anymore. They're like, it's over now. We're back where we were. We don't have to think about it. And that is also a function of unreliable narrators having dominance in these newsrooms because they don't know, they can't see the really awful cracks that opened up over the past 4 years. You know, they weren't there in the streets when Black Lives Matter kicked off. They, you know, they were complicit in all these narratives about vandalism and looting and insecurity. So it's kind of a roundabout way of saying, if you recruit from the establishment, you will get an establishment-friendly worldview, which then maintains the status quo and is suspicious of change all the time.
Right, so that there is a real need to really look at who's telling the story, who are we pulling from, and you know, I know this is overused word, but diversifying who's telling the story. That if there's ever the same people from the same class, the same group telling, they're the ones who are telling the story, there's stories that are missing, and they're vital stories that are missing.
Yeah, and that's just a very easy test. There's some very simple tests that one can apply. That's just a very simple test. If you just think, you know, is there a uniformity of demographic, right? Do these people all look the same and sound the same? And, you know, and are not surprising you with anything you didn't know, then that's kind of it's
right.
This is an unreliable narrator. You know what I mean?
Right. Can you speak a little bit about, so one of the things that I appreciated in reading your book is just, you know, you took time to talk through and debunk the myths. And we're living in an age of sound bites and Twitter. And how have you, as both a journalist and a writer, kept people engaged in the conversation long enough to leave the conversation not like with, I never thought about it that way? Because I think that's what I find, that where's the room to have the space, you know, where people are listening for something that they haven't heard before?
That's such a great question. It has a couple of answers. So one of the ways I try and find space to have these good faith conversations is to know when not to have them, right? So the most helpful thing I've landed on is to know when it's going to be a waste of time, right? When the conversation is a duel, right? When it's just about like someone winning, and that means social media had to go out the window immediately. Like I just stopped doing any of this on social media in any meaningful way, because I realized that social media is set up as a gladiatorial, adversarial place, and therefore there's not going to be any sort of useful conversation to be had there. So that was the first thing. The second thing is to, as Edward Said said, I actually have this quote written down. I'm just going to read it to you. Edward Said said that there are ways, it's important when you start having these conversations to not make people reach for their gun immediately. So you don't want to make people feel like you are an adversary and that you're trying to like win or land a point, and it's very easy actually to do that. It's like one of the things that, again, when you kind of train as a sort of polemicist or opinion writer, is that you realize there's two ways to make an argument. There's a really easy, very satisfying way, which is like a cheap hit, which is to make a point, right? We can all make a point. And then there's trying to get somewhere, right? And getting somewhere is much harder because you have to restrain and discipline yourself, not to sound smug or superior or all-knowing, or you know, trying to make people feel like they are stupid. Like these are all things that you have to be very careful about. And so these are the two things I've kind of done more, is engage less in spaces that I think are not going to be fruitful, and spend more time and more of an effort, or less of an effort in making a point, and more of an effort in thinking of these conversations as only useful when we have landed somewhere, we've got somewhere, either me or my interlocutor. You know, I'm not pretending that I know everything as well. So that's how I've gone about it.
No, and I just like, how do we infuse that idea in the larger culture, right? I mean, that is, yeah. Can you speak a little bit about the crisis of free speech? Because I think that is just a where the media again has sort of whether they're wanting the, you know, many people to tune in, that all sorts of people are getting voices where they, I think, you know, the news sources want people to battle, right? Because, and maybe, you know, because they want the ratings. But if you can speak a little bit to how this crisis is again, a free speech is a myth, and then also, how do we, in conversations where people are saying, well, I have a right to say anything I want, and are not paying attention to the consequences of some of the things said?
Yeah, and so I'm just looking at my little notes here about the free speech crisis, because it's one of the most difficult crises to convince people that it doesn't exist, right? It's just incredibly complicated, and actually there are several things going on. So one of the first things that I like to say about the free speech crisis is we have free speech, right? We've always had, or we've had free speech for a very long time. Along the free speech that we've had, we have always had curbs on free speech. This is a thing that somehow has become lost in the conversation. You and I right now, we are subject to free speech limitations. We can't libel someone. We can't pass off someone's ideas as my own. We can't plagiarize someone. These are all free speech curbs. Most people are okay with free speech curbs because they realize that they protect you as well. So people are generally pro libel laws because they're like, it would be crazy if I just allowed anyone to libel me. So one of the things that has fallen away very quickly from the free speech crisis conversation is all the free speech curbs that we have been okay with and have contributed to the smooth running of society for a very long time. That's the first thing. The second thing is the free speech crisis is always linked to, or is more commonly linked to, people on the margins objecting to what people at the center are saying about them. That's kind of your clue, right? So one thing I say in the book is, you know, when you're trying to decide what is a free speech event or not, you know, if someone is saying you're curbing my free speech, look at the two parties. Who has more power, right? The person who has more power is likely to be the person crying loudest about their free speech, right? A, because they're not accustomed to being questioned, and B, because they generally have more access to the platforms of speech, right? So that then goes to the third component, which is this idea that speech is free because we live in a marketplace of ideas. The marketplace of ideas is the stupidest principle in kind of modern political discourse, and the fact that we have allowed it to flourish for so long is really worrying. But it's linked to, without getting too far into these details, it's linked to, again, this individualist, neoliberal, meritocratic culture.
Can you just say a little, because that was a great, the market, can you just give a little summary of the marketplace of ideas? Yeah, great. Yeah,
so the marketplace of ideas is the same as the kind of actual marketplace in a capitalist society. You know, so when people say, you know, you release a good or a service into the world, and if it's useful, people will buy it. And if it's bad, people will leave it. The same applies to the idea of the marketplace of ideas, which is that we should have absolute free speech, because if there are bad ideas, people just won't listen to them, right? People just won't like them. which suggests that no one's really had a look at history. And so when people say like, you should shut down racist speech or anti-Semitic speech, or speech that incites violence against women, they're like, but the marketplace of ideas is here and it functions. And instead of bringing in the state to curb people's freedoms, trust people to adopt good ideas and reject bad ones. Now, there are many reasons why this is flawed. One is history. People take up bad ideas all the time. And the second thing is that not everyone has the same access to this marketplace, right? It's usually more powerful that have access to the marketplace. And so I think of the marketplace of ideas as more like, in the book, I call it like a commissary, right? In a prison where you have very few wares, very few products, and those are the only things that you can choose from, because the prison warden has a monopoly on what he brings into the prison. You as a prisoner, you as a marginalized person can't be like, well, can I have some milkshakes, please? They're like, no, because you don't run this show. And so if you think about, for example, the fact that certain people have very easy access to the media, they're invited as talking heads on debating shows, they have columns, they are very well networked in the media. Trump is an amazing example of this because he had this huge access to the marketplace of ideas. And Trump's detractors, I mean, how are you gonna get to the marketplace? How are you gonna get a column? How are you gonna go on TV? You know, there is a real monopoly, again, related to unreliable narrators, a real monopoly on who has the platforms to speak. The mere fact that platforms are concentrated amongst a few means that we do not have free speech, right? We have monopolies on free speech. We have people shut out from the free speech market. And what happens is when those people who have just begun to have the means to push back against the way the center demonizes them via social, they've had the access via social media, via generally just kind of being more vocal in their organizations, just this act of objection and saying, you can't say that, that's not cool, you should allow this to happen, has been framed as a massive crisis of free speech because the powerful are not accustomed to being questioned. And the tool that has convinced people that there is a free speech crisis is that it has framed free speech as an absolute. And everyone knows, or everyone should know, that free speech is not and never has been absolute. So once that argument is addressed, then the entire free speech crisis argument falls apart.
Yeah, I'm just pausing with that.
I struggle to go through the free speech crisis and all its iterations because, like I said, it has so many different components. But the main thing is just the thing I try and drum into people's heads is to just think about the absolute free speech concept and look at all the ways in which our speech is curbed in healthy ways all the time.
Right. And for me, the image of like, and the practice of noticing who are the people who are complaining that they're, and not just complaining, but with great, sort of vehemence, saying like my free speech is being, impinged upon. And it's typically white people, and it's typically white people in power. So it is it is a little scary, but good to keep in mind in these, having conversations and challenging some of these myths in action. So we've got about 10 minutes left, and I don't, Jennifer, do you have any questions, or I have a few more questions I have many more questions, but.
Well, I'm just going to remind the audience that they can ask a question in the Q&A tab. And Catherine, why don't you just give us one more question? Okay. Can you, Nesrine, just say some of the things that you are hopeful for as you are seeing the movements
moving in spite of the tools, that the current power structure continues to sort of lay out. Tell us some of what you're feeling hopeful for and some things that you want to encourage us to keep doing.
So I love talking about this because it was really hard writing this book and quite depressing in areas, because every time I picked up a thread, it led to a think tank that had a ton of money, or it led to, a very established myth that people had never questioned, or it led to, a few powerful people in the media. It felt a little bit like when you're young and you think everything is a conspiracy, then you grow up and you think that was naive, obviously not everything is a conspiracy, and then you do some research and you're like, no, everything is a conspiracy. And so I kind of got into that space where I was like, wow, this is actually a lot more hardwired and a lot more obviously linked to powerful brokers, financial and political, that want to maintain the status quo. So how do you fight them? But then by the end of the book, specifically after the summer of Black Lives Matter, when I kind of wrapped it up, I realized that I had also, in a weird way, succumbed to the ubiquity of these myths, because I hadn't realized that what these myths were also doing is that they were a veil, they were a blanket that stood between me and other like-minded people, right? So what they do when they marginalize people is they don't just make them peripheral, they stop them from connecting with each other because they don't see each other, they have no access to each other, they're not in the media, they're disempowered. And one of the most dangerous ways in which we can be disempowered is to feel like we are alone. And what I felt after Black Lives Matter in the summer, and generally via talking to people through the process of writing this book, is that there are a lot of us, and they are brilliant and spirited and connected to a rich legacy of freedom fighting and building on that legacy. And one of the ways in which it is extremely effective fighting these myths is just to have a bit of swagger and be like, I see your right-wing think tank, but I know 10 people in my neighborhood, in my institution, that have raised X funds for X cause, right? That I found incredibly inspiriting. And so I end the book, and every time I feel a bit down, I go back and read the end of the book, because it takes me back to a moment where I realized that one of the ways in which I had become weakened in the process of uncovering all these myths and the powerful people behind them is it made me think that I had no people, right? But I do. They're just not in those positions. So one of the very powerful ways in which these myths can be countered is just to know that you're backed up. Find your people, find your connections, fight in your own way, where you are, like fight where you sit, in the small ways that you can. And once that happens, it's just an incredibly powerful thing, because you realize that, underpinning these myths is really powerful, tangible stuff, money, networks, lobbies, but really underpinning them in a way that is deeper than that is confidence and a sensibility of ownership and kind of virtue, like this is our house, right? That kind of gives myths their really powerful undergirding. And once you meet people from the margins that have that sense, it melts, so it is rattled incredibly easily. So that's kind of my like the energy that I've taken away from the book. And it has given me personally a huge boost, understanding that, even in the way I talk about these things, and I address them, in the way I interact with the tools and the myth propagators from that perspective has been very helpful.
So you're not standing alone. You bring your your community with you.
Yeah, and even if they're not physically with me, I
Right.
know that they will hear me, or it will come back to them, or I will hear them. It's just always kind of, one thing I'm asked quite a lot is, how do young people cultivate that sense of confidence that the future is theirs? And I'm like, step out of your comfort zone, find your people. Don't let the myths convince you that these narrow circles in which we are limited are unbreakable, basically.
Right. Certainly not the whole story. Right. Now, can I ask, are you, what's your next book?
Oh my God.
I mean, you don't have to. I mean, but do you have something you're, I mean, again, I'm not, this was, you don't have to write anything as far as I'm concerned.
No,
but
I honestly,
I am curious.
I feel sometimes that I will never write a book again, because for a first book, it was a real baptism of fire. But I think, I don't know if it'll be a whole book, but what I'm really interested in now is, or just something I'm trying to research more, is how people hold two ideas in their heads at the same time, that people can feel that they are good, but also behave in ways politically that are not good, that harm other people. And there was an image in the last election, the beginning of this year, that really stuck with me, of elderly Trump voters in a kind of, slightly fractious setting at a voting station, running to the help of like young people of color who felt that they were being bullied. And I was like, this is so interesting that there is, having written a book about how sort of the problems that we keep running into are because of these hardwired attitudes. I think the next layer after that is to see then, how do people maintain their sense of virtue, maintain their sense of goodness, maintain their belief that they are upstanding individuals who behave in ways in their everyday life that are virtuous, but then when it comes to politics, completely disconnect. And behave in ways that are immediately and clearly harmful to other people. I don't know how that works. So I'm curious in kind of picking that bit. I don't know if it'll be a book, but it's a thought for now. Let's see.
I look forward to reading it. Listen, I want to say thank you so much. And I want to encourage everyone to please, it's a great book. And I'm not just saying, there's two different copies. That was the one from what?
Yeah, and then there's the US one that has a far more sober cover.
I think I like the UK one better, but either way, I really, for those who haven't read it yet, it's just something to take the time to read, and just your thinking and how you help us through some of the ideas where we can get stuck in conversation. I just think it will help sort of this, of moving things along. I love that sort of idea, that to engage in conversations that move things to another place, even it means that you're changed or the other person is changed, as opposed to just, staying hard in your position. So
yeah, comfort zones are incredibly dangerous things, because we reinforce ourselves and we feel secure, but we also don't further understanding of ourselves or each other when we do that. And so it's uncomfortable, and sometimes it's unpleasant, actually, especially in the kind of discourse that we have these days, but it is endlessly rewarding, I think, because you develop a muscle for a kind of discipline, intellectual rigor, and a kind of search for the truth. And it sounds pompous, but that's basically what we're in this for.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much for this. I have my copy, so anybody who's watching, you can order your copy too. There's a link in the chat right now, or you can go back to the event webpage and follow the link there to purchase Nesrine's book, because I think we all need to be paying more attention to all of this. And again, thank you both for coming. And Nesrine, I know it's super late where you are right now, so thank you again for staying awake.
I'm grateful. Thank you.
And for those of you at home, you can also borrow the book from the library, obviously. But for those of you at home, look out for more Westport Library events, and you can watch recorded events from westportlibrary.org. Thank you all for coming today, and we really, really, really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.